Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Haggerty, no. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Cardin, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Tuberville, no. Mr. Lujan, aye. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye.
I liked Paul, but like,
Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst. No. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds. No. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren. Aye. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney. Aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. No. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane. Aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker. No. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee. No. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly. Aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy. No. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso. No. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. No. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines. No. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden. Aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy. No. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton. No. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr. No. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan. Aye. Ms. Rono. Ms. Rono. Aye. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher. No. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye.
People's right now to see the two versions of the schedule. If you want to come down, sit at dining room. Okay. So you can see. So we put that.
Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Padilla,
Because then we can.
aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Portman, no. Okay. Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye.
Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez. Is there anyone wishing to vote or change their vote? On this vote, the yeas are 53, the nays are 47, and the motion is agreed to.
Mr. President,
The senior senator from Vermont.
thank you, Mr. President. Today is an historic day. Today, each member of the Senate will have the opportunity to cast a vote on the nomination of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to be an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. I say historic because throughout our nation's history, only 115 people have served on the Supreme Court. Until now, only 5 of the Supreme Court justices have been women. Only 2 of the justices have been black, and none has been a black woman. So history indeed, and long overdue. But I'm not going to cast my vote in support of Judge Jackson's confirmation because she is a woman or because she is black. I will cast that vote because she is eminently qualified to serve in the position to which she's been nominated. Her nomination shouldn't just be welcomed, it should be celebrated. It's a major step forward for our democracy. It's further widening the lens to help make our nation more inclusive and more representative with each passing generation. She is one of the most qualified nominees of the Supreme Court that I've ever considered in my 48 years here. Graduate at Harvard and Harvard Law School, a judicial clerk at the district, circuit, and Supreme Court levels, a federal appellate judge, a federal district court judge, a member of the U.S. Sentencing Commission, an attorney in private practice. And she'll be the first ever justice who has served as a public defender, bringing that much needed perspective to the court. No one can argue that Judge Jackson is not objectively qualified to be confirmed. And the manufactured accusations that are thrown at her by some of our committee during our hearings not only fell flat, but they've been refuted and debunked by serious voices across the political spectrum. They hold no water. They serve only to showcase the vitriol and the contempt with which some members of this body approach their sacred constitutional role of advice and consent. I said it during the hearings, and I'll say it again. It's distressing, it's disheartening, and as the Dean of the Senate, it is saddening. Yet I find hope in the fact that Judge Jackson's confirmation to our highest court will have the bipartisan support it deserves, that commands. I commend the Republican senators who have lauded her qualifications and staked their support of her nomination. Judge Jackson has earned the president's nomination, and she has earned confirmation from the Senate. Each and every day, millions of American families are living their lives and how they live those lives, from the salaries they make to the education their children receive and scores of issues in between, directly impacted by the decisions made at the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, in fact, all of our courts, can't be ivory towers accessible only to and bending to the will of a select few in our society. They have to be accountable to all Americans. To do so, they must reflect the diversity of our nation, the diversity that's at the foundation of our democracy, diversity of gender, of race, of creed, of education and history. but also diversity of thought and life experiences. Judge Jackson brings that and more to the bench. Mr. President, I'm proud to be the President pro tempore of the Senate, and I was proud to have chaired the Senate Judiciary Committee in the past. In that regard, I voted for the first woman to ever serve on the Supreme Court. I voted for the first Latina to serve on the Supreme Court. I voted on thousands of judicial nominations, nominees of both Republican and Democratic presidents. I voted for nominees to the Supreme Court who were put forward by Republican presidents. I've long lamented the increasing political gamemanship that has affected our current confirmation process. And many times on this floor, I've warned about the dire consequences for our courts and for our democracy of converting our confirmation process into a zero-sum game where one party wins and one party loses. But to change that gamemanship requires that we have some adults in the room. That we all come here to the floor of the United States Senate not to score a headline or a trending tweet, but simply to do our jobs. There's only 100 of us to represent this whole country. So who's going to do that today? Simply do their jobs. I've taken a clear look at Judge Jackson's record. I heard her testimony 2 weeks ago. I met with her. I read opinions that she has written. I spent hours listening to her. I saw her intellect, her humility, and her temperament on full display. Mr. President, she's the justice we need now. For Americans today, for the generations to come, for our children and our grandchildren, for all of us, I will cast my vote to confirm Judge Jackson, and I'll do it proudly. And I hope the Senate can rise to this moment. I hope it can be the deliberative body the founders envisioned when they conceived of this great experiment. Our independent judiciary, in fact, our democracy, demanded of us. Mr. President, history will remember the votes cast here today. I will proudly vote aye. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The senator from Georgia.
Mr. President, I rise today to express my joy in voting to confirm Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to the United States Supreme Court. What a great day it is for the United States of America, for our system of government, and the grand march toward the fulfillment of the sacred covenant we have with one another as an American people, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. Ketanji Brown Jackson's improbable journey to the nation's highest court is a reflection of our own journey through fits and starts toward the nation's highest ideals. She embodies the arc of our history. The very fine product of public schools. Both her parents attended segregated primary schools before graduating from historically black colleges and universities. She is a two-time graduate of Harvard, a former clerk to Supreme Court Justice Breyer, to whom the nation owes enormous thanks for his decades of public service. a former federal public defender who would be the first of her kind to serve on the Supreme Court, a jurist who has gone before the Senate on 3 separate occasions and each time has garnered strong bipartisan support, a judge who has heard cases both in the U.S. District Court and our Federal Court of Appeals, a judge who has the strong endorsement of critical stakeholders from across our justice system, from the American Bar Association to those who advocate for civil rights, to organizations representing our nation's brave law enforcement officers. All of them respect Ketanji Brown Jackson. She's a wife and a working mom. She is America at its best. That I believe in my heart after meeting with her in my office, talking to folks whom I trust, who know her, and hearing her testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Under intense questioning before the committee, much of it appropriate and necessary, some of it outrageous and beyond the pale. She demonstrated her legal acumen, sharp intellect, and the kind of temperament we need on the bench, especially at a time like this. If there were any doubts about her character, she more than proved her poise, her skill, composure, and the depth of her patriotism through the process. Amazing grace under pressure. As a voice for Georgians in the Senate, I've said from the beginning that people in my state want someone on the court who is fair, eminently qualified, and has a record of protecting the constitutional rights and freedoms of Georgians and Americans. And that's why my office has received thousands of emails and phone calls from Georgians in every corner of our state, voicing their support for Judge Jackson's confirmation. So after hearing from Georgians and thoroughly evaluating her nomination, I'm ecstatic to say that Judge Jackson is an excellent jurist who has the temperament and discernment to sit on our nation's highest court. Mr. President, the people of Georgia made this appointment possible by making history last year. So in addition to thanking Georgia for this moment, I want to acknowledge that the historic nature of her appointment isn't lost on me. Like my brother, Senator Booker, I know what it has taken for Judge Jackson to get to this moment, and nobody's going to steal my joy. Yes, I'm a senator. I'm a pastor. But beyond all of that, I'm the father of a young black girl. I know how much it means for Judge Jackson to have navigated the double jeopardy of racism and sexism to now stand in the glory of this moment in all of her excellence. For my 5-year-old daughter, and for so many young women in our country, but really, if we're thinking about it right, for all of us, seeing Judge Jackson ascend to the Supreme Court reflects the promise of progress on which our democracy rests. So what a great day it is in America. Today, the word of justice and equal protection under the law becomes flesh and lives among us in new ways. Today, at the highest levels of our government, the administration of our Constitution looks a little bit more like what it says. And it fills me with great pride for our country, how far we have come, and what we can achieve together. Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson is beyond qualified, and I'm beyond thrilled to speak for Georgia in voting to confirm her to the United States Supreme Court. Thanks, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, while we all gather to acknowledge this historic day and prepare to vote to, in my case at least, confirm Judge Jackson, I rise to bring up another issue. I rise today to urge my colleagues to pass into law common sense legislation to bring down oil and gas costs for Americans. As many of my colleagues have discussed on this floor, Americans across the country, including in my state of New Hampshire, are facing higher costs from the grocery store to the gas pump. As we work together to build a stronger, more resilient economy that strengthens our supply chains and invests in American manufacturing, we must also bring relief to American families right now, an issue that has become even more urgent in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has sent gas prices soaring. As we continue to counter Putin's aggression and inflationary challenges facing our economy, we have an obligation to work together to bring down costs. That's why I'm working to hold big oil accountable for profiting off of the pain that Americans are experiencing at the pump. And that's why I've pushed the administration to release oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, an action I was glad to see the administration take again just last week. As we look at all options to bring down costs, one clear way to provide immediate relief is by suspending the gas tax for the remainder of this year. Earlier this year, my colleagues and I introduced a bill to do exactly that. The Gas Prices Relief Act will temporarily suspend the federal gas tax through the end of the year, helping bring economic relief to families. Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Finance Committee be discharged and the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Senate Bill 3609, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Idaho, yes.
reserving the right to object. Let me begin by saying that my friends and colleagues across the aisle are right about one thing. Gas prices are incredibly high right now in this country. The effort to blame this on what's happened in Ukraine, however, overlooks the real cause of the phenomenal rise in gas prices that we've seen for a year before Putin even invaded. Definitely, the invasion did increase pressure on gas prices, but the problem is that this administration's policies have dramatically reduced the supply in the United States, and Americans across this country know how supply and demand impacts price. The gas tax holiday that is now being proposed is not a solution. It is a political gimmick that would not stop skyrocketing gas prices or inflation. In fact, Larry Summers said in a Wall Street Journal podcast, "I think a gas tax idea is saved only by its triviality from being one of the worst public policy ideas of the decade. It will have little effect over any reasonable horizon on prices. It will be counterproductive from an environmental point of view. It is the ultimate policy gimmick. Rather than accept responsibility for 14 months of reckless spending or the more than 40% increase in gas prices that had already occurred before the Russian invasion, Democrats want to blame higher gas prices on the Russian invasion or corporate greed. They also want to ignore the consequences of their relentless attacks on the American oil and gas industry. the administration's overly bureaucratic permit and regulatory process for domestic energy production, and the misguided policy decisions like canceling the Keystone XL pipeline. The solution to rising gas prices is not a tax holiday, which would offer little relief but threaten infrastructure investments and worsen our national debt situation. Nor is the solution a tax on American companies who increase their production of oil and gas to try to help us become more energy independent. Nor is it stimulus checks, which have the potential, as the past ones have, to increase gas prices even further and push inflation even higher. Nor is it to encourage other hostile regimes to produce more oil. The only lasting solution to our current problems is to bolster American oil and gas production to replace not only Russian imports, but to facilitate exports to support our allies and end their dependence on Russia. Indeed, I, along with a number of my Republican colleagues, have sponsored proposals to enhance U.S. energy independence and undo many of President Biden's misguided energy policies. Republicans believe we can and should be doing more to unleash America's domestic energy potential, reduce reliance on volatile foreign actors like Russia, and deliver cost savings to middle-class families across the country. Hardworking American families need real relief, not political gimmicks. And that's why I oppose this gas tax holiday. I urge my Democrat colleagues to abandon the reckless spending and tax policies that have already failed, but which seem to be contemplated in the President's now newly reintroduced budget, and support proposals that will actually lower prices for everyday Americans. And for those reasons, Mr. President, I do object.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President, before I wrap up, I just want to point out that what you've just heard, what the American people have just heard, is talking points straight out of Big Oil's playbook. A gas tax holiday is a common sense solution that would provide immediate relief for Granite Staters and Americans all over the country. Big Oil holds thousands of unused permits at their fingertips that they could use right now to increase supply. And instead, what is happening is Big Oil is padding its pockets at the expense of Americans. And let's be clear, this would not take a dime out of the Highway Trust Fund, because this bill instructs Treasury to replenish the trust fund, something it has done half a dozen times in about the last decade. This is something that has bipartisan support across the country. Democratic and Republican governors, Democratic and Republican legislatures are moving to suspend their gas taxes. This is something we could do right now to help American families balance their budgets and make ends meet. So while I am disappointed to see my colleague block this critical legislation, I will keep working to bring down costs for American families and get this bill passed.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that all post-cloture time on the Jackson nomination expire at 1:45 p.m. today.
Without objection.
And, Mr. President, for the information of the Senate, there'll be a roll call vote at 1:45 p.m. today on confirmation of the nomination of Ketanji Brown Jackson to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. Senators are encouraged to be seated prior to the start of the vote and are encouraged to cast their vote from their desk. Yield the floor.
Senator for Louisiana.
Mr. President, I rise to speak about saving school choice or perhaps parental choice. Mr. President, some students learn differently than others do. I'm the parent of a child with dyslexia. I can tell you that as any such parent knows, one-size-fits-all education does not work. Parents and students should have the ability to choose the learning environment that is best for that child. And I think the parent can make the choice better than the school board and certainly better than bureaucrats in the Department of Education here in Washington, D.C. The charter school program was created by Congress for that exact purpose, to ensure that parents could choose what's best for their child. Power to the parent. Giving parents the power is crucial to allowing every student to succeed. Unfortunately, there are groups working to undermine the power the parent should have to choose their child's school. The U.S. Department of Education has decided to disregard what's in the best interest of the student with a new proposed rule that adds new requirements for applicants completely unrelated to student outcomes. Applicants would have to demonstrate an unmet need for charter school, provide evidence of over-enrollment at existing public schools in order to establish a charter school. It seems as if the Department of Education is putting up arbitrary barriers to opening a charter school simply out of prejudice. They don't want the parent to have the power. Our country's charter schools are under threat from the far left and from teachers' unions who seek to shut them down because charter school staffs are difficult to unionize. Now, these unions know it's much harder to spread their influence in charter schools. In some cases, it is frankly impossible for a charter school to unionize, and the giant unions see this as a simple problem. They know the more charter schools there are, the less revenue they get. So their solution is equally as simple. Take power away from parents with layers of new bureaucracy and government regulation. We should not let that happen. And let's just put this in perspective. Since the pandemic began, it has been public charter schools that have seen a substantial increase in demand. They opened up sooner, and they stayed open in larger numbers than traditional public schools. And we know that open schools are better for children. Parents should have the power to send their child to a school where they feel like they, the parent, have a voice, and where they know their child is more likely to succeed. Now, let's be clear who this rule is written for. Not for the parent and not for the child. It is not written to help the student. It is written to help unions exercise more control over a student's life. This rule makes no mention of how many of these new restrictions improve student achievement or actually help students. And at a time when students are falling behind in record numbers, we need new and innovative approaches to our education system, not just hand the keys over to a special interest group. The truth is, these rules will give less choice to families, will hold students back, and do more harm than good. Now, the charter school program has enjoyed bipartisan support for nearly 30 years. Any substantial change to the program should go through Congress and receive thoughtful consideration. And parent choice for the school their child attends should not be gutted by an informal committee of union employees and education department officials. Those of us who care about the student, those of us who see the role of charter schools, we have one message to Secretary of Education Cardona: back off of our charter schools. With that, I yield, and Mr. President, I now ask that the second part of my remarks be entered into the record as if a separate.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, I want to take the moment to recognize the career of a beloved and trusted Louisiana journalist, radio host, and friend to all, Robert J. Wright of Shreveport, Louisiana. After 50 years in radio, Robert has announced he retires later this month. His last day is Friday, April the 29th, one day after his 70th birthday, well-earned retirement. Robert is a masterful storyteller and a critical thinker, always finding the other side of a story. He's been a voice of reason and always looking for the truth. He took his first job in radio while attending LSU Shreveport. As he says, quote, "It was indoors and you didn't have to carry stuff," end quote. About as good a summary of a good job as you could ever ask. He went on to host morning shows in Philadelphia, Cleveland, and Orlando before eventually moving back to Shreveport in 1996. That's when he first teamed up with his long-term co-host, Aaron McCarty, to start their morning show that has been a part of Northwest Louisiana's morning commute for over 25 years. He and McCarty moved their show and has been the town square of Shreveport on Keel ever since. To say that he will be missed is an understatement. Their show has been as much a part of many in Northwest Louisiana's daily routine as a morning cup of coffee. When you interview with Robert, it's clear you're speaking with someone who cares about the issues facing his community just as much as you do. He has earned the time and trust of his listeners. So congratulations to Robert J. Wright on an impressive and meaningful career. Robert, I can tell you there are many who are pretty upset about the news, and that is a testament to the positive impact you've had on our community. Robert, we in Louisiana wish you a happy and well-earned retirement. And with that, I yield the floor.
The senator for Iowa.
Soon, we'll be voting on Judge Jackson's nomination, and I'd like to explain why I'm voting against her appointment to the Supreme Court. Since the White House announced Judge Jackson's nomination, I have emphasized the need for a thorough and fair process. Unfortunately, the majority party weren't concerned about the rigorous examination of her record. The White House and the majority party have shielded important information. We don't have any non-public document from her time at the Sentencing Commission, and the Obama White House held back more than 48,000 pages. Judge Jackson also gave the White House confidential, non-public probation recommendations for some of her cases. But when we asked about a probation document filed on the Hawkins case, Judge Jackson claimed that she was not able to access records for her old cases because that was allegedly because she was no longer on the district court. And we now know that she sits on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. Now, if that's true, there are many unanswered questions about how information the White House thought was helpful was so easily obtained. So we should take into account that all the helpful information has already been leaked. That brings me to the merits of Judge Jackson's nomination. For judicial nominees, their philosophy ought to decide how to decide cases ought to be of primary consideration. Part of having a judicial philosophy is having an understanding of the fundamental principles of our Constitution. Natural rights are a part of that system. Judge Jackson explained to us that she does not, quote, hold a position on whether individuals possess natural rights. Now that ought to be very shocking. Natural rights are basic to our constitutional system and principles of limited government. because we all know our country was founded on the belief that's expressed in the Declaration of Independence: all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that was further nailed down in the Constitution of the United States. Our Constitution vests the three branches of government with very limited power. All other powers not given to the federal government are reserved to the states and to the people thereof. The principle of limited government is what makes America an exceptional nation and sets our Constitution apart. Judges must have a proper understanding of those basic principles, and the way Judge Jackson answered those questions, particularly the answers she gave to Senator Cruz, shows that she lacks that very necessary foundation. Now I want to go on to a few other examples. At the hearing, Judge Jackson testified about one of her decisions involving the First Step Act. In that case, prosecutors had rock-solid evidence against a dangerous drug kingpin. But Judge Jackson was displeased the government pursued a mandatory minimum sentence. So she misused a motion for compassionate release to resentence that person to a sentence she thought he deserved. As the lead author of the First Step Act, I know that's not what we wrote the statute to do. The act was supposed to allow elderly inmates and those suffering from terminal illness to petition the court for a sentence reduction. The statute also allows for a reduction if the court finds an extraordinary and compelling reason. Judges should use great discretion. Judges should weigh against the charge the dangers to society and the risk of recidivism. At her hearing, Judge Jackson said that she based her extraordinary and compelling finding on the non-retroactive changes to the law. This radical interpretation is terrible and dangerous. Congress chose which provisions of the First Step Act would apply retroactively. The Senate is currently considering legislation that I co-sponsored with Chairman Durbin that makes some of the First Step Act provisions retroactive. But that's Congress's role, not Judge Jackson's role. Senator Durbin and I wouldn't have been able to broker a compromise on that legislation if senators thought the judges would rewrite the law and insert their own views from the bench. Decisions like this will make bipartisan work, particularly on criminal justice reform, harder to do. That case by the name of Young is just one example of Judge Jackson's lenient approach to criminal law and sentencing. She also declined to apply a number of sentencing enhancements that Congress put into the sentencing guidelines. A case by the name of Make the Road New York versus McAleen is another case that shows how Judge Jackson used her methodology to reach a result that contradicts the plain text of the law. Congress gave the Secretary of Homeland Security, and these are the words from the law, sole and unreviewable discretion to decide whether illegal immigrants should be subject to expedited removal within 2 years. Judge Jackson reviewed the agency's decision anyway, and it seems clear why. She went out of her lane to comment on the policy as, in her words, a terrible proposal. And she claimed that the government attorney made an argument that reeks of bad faith. Reeks of bad faith are her words. In fact, her decision and her rhetoric are unfounded. So that's why her decision earned a strong rebuke from the panel of liberal and conservative judges when she was reversed by the D.C. Circuit. Judge Millett, an Obama appointee, explained it this way in the opinion, quote, "There could hardly be a more definitive expression of congressional intent than sole and unreviewable discretion." These are just a few examples of Judge Jackson's judicial activism, because her record clearly shows she does not believe in or act within the limited and proper role of a judge. So I will vote against her confirmation. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, this Capitol building has served as the backdrop for some of the most notable moments in America's history. In this building, wars have been declared, peace treaties have been signed, and the march toward progress has either moved forward or has been stopped in its tracks. Today, the members of this Senate have the opportunity to take a monumental step forward. We will vote to confirm a once-in-a-generation legal talent, a jurist with outstanding credentials and a lifetime of experience, and the first ever African-American woman to serve as Justice of the Supreme Court, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. Judge Jackson's confirmation will be a glass-shattering achievement for America. Consider this moment in history. When the Supreme Court first met in this building in February of 1801, there were 1 million slaves in this nation, a nation of 5 million people. This very building was built with the labor of enslaved people. And at the time the court met, neither black Americans nor white women had a constitutionally guaranteed right to vote. Women had no place in that first Supreme Court chamber, and black women would only enter to clean it in the dark of the night. We know what followed. America's battle to end slavery saw a bloody civil war, decades of efforts to break down racial barriers, and the efforts continue to this day. And our struggle to enfranchise and empower women did not end with the 19th Amendment 102 years ago. It continues to this day as well, as we strive to give our daughters the same opportunities we give our sons. This confirmation of the first black woman to the Supreme Court honors the history that has come before it. It honors the struggles of the past, of the men and women who waged them. And this confirmation draws America one step closer, one step to healing our nation, one step closer to a more perfect union. Nearly a century after our founding, we guaranteed the rights of citizenship finally to every American, including for the first time those who were born into bondage with the ratification of the 14th Amendment. It took a long century later for us to expand the bounds of liberty again. We ensured the federal government could vigorously protect the right to vote, the most fundamental of rights, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1967. One victory for progress begat the next. 2 years after the Voting Rights Act, we confirmed the first black American to ever serve on the Supreme Court, Justice Thurgood Marshall. But I'd like to remind you, that was 50 years ago. Now, with the passage of that time, we are beginning to write another chapter in our nation's quest for equal justice under the law. And that chapter begins with 3 letters, KBJ. With Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson's confirmation to the highest court in the land, we are not only making history, we are carrying on a great American tradition, elevating one of our nation's best and brightest legal minds to an honored position of service. There's no one more deserving of this high honor. As we've learned over the past month, she is the best of us. She has devoted her life to serving our country. She's done so at every level of the federal judiciary, and at every turn she's distinguished herself. When I hear the critics say she's soft on crime, I wonder how they explain that she was endorsed by the largest law enforcement agency and organization in America, the Fraternal Order of Police, as well as the International Chiefs of Police, as well as an army of federal prosecutors who have appeared in her courts. She's dedicated to protecting judicial independence, to advancing freedom and liberty, and deciding every case, as she says, from a neutral posture. That's exactly what you'll find in evaluating nearly 10 years of service on the bench. I hear senators come to the floor and say, well, there's one opinion I disagree with. For goodness sakes, she's issued almost 600 written opinions in 10 years on the bench in the district court. She's been reversed a small percentage of the time. Her work speaks for itself. And when you evaluate it, you'll find out she's thoughtful and even-handed. As the American people saw during last month's hearing in the Judiciary Committee, Judge Jackson has the right judicial temperament. Calm, collected, she answered every question, even when the questions were hostile and confrontational. She answered them with dignity and grace and stood by for more than 24 hours of questioning. She's a proven consensus builder. She's been confirmed by the Senate on a bipartisan basis more than three times, I should say, and soon we hope she'll be confirmed again by a bipartisan majority. She's earned the support from leaders across the political and ideological spectrum, civil rights leaders, leaders in law enforcement, former federal judges appointed by Democrats and Republicans. All of them have lined up proudly to endorse her. Perhaps most importantly, Justice Jackson will help ensure that the law works for the people and that the people understand the workings of the court. For many Americans, what happens in a courtroom can be cold and impersonal. Judge Jackson has made a habit of making it real. She looks people in the eye, walks them through her decision-making with patience and empathy, and she reaches every one of her decisions by following the facts and the law wherever they lead. She said that her opinions can run long. That's by design, because she wants America to rest assured, whether she writes in the majority, the concurrence, or dissent, they want to know exactly where she stands on the most important issues. Serving as chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee during Judge Jackson's confirmation has been one of the highest honors of my Senate experience. I want to give special thanks to the man who spoke before me, Republican Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa. His friendship and fairness have really guided our relationship throughout this historic process. In the weeks since President Biden announced her nomination, Judge Jackson has already lifted the spirit of countless Americans, inspiring a new generation of aspiring jurists and public servants. Millions of Americans see themselves in Judge Jackson. Black Americans, members of law enforcement families, working moms, public high school graduates, like her fellow Palmetto Panthers in Florida. Everywhere I've gone for the last few weeks when I go home, visiting law schools, going to the grocery store, I've been approached by people who've been following this nomination closely. They tell me how deeply impressed they are with Judge Jackson, even under fire from her critics. Hannah Edmondson is one of those people. She's a law student in Waukegan, Illinois, a city on the shores of Lake Michigan. In a letter to my office, Hannah wrote, and I quote her in saying, "If you can see it, you can be it." And I'm very excited to see America's first black female justice. Reverend Krista Alston is a Baptist minister in the city of Chicago. comes from a long line of Baptist ministers. She calls herself a civil rights baby, born in '64, the year LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act. Ricky Jones is also from Chicago. She's been working for civil rights for nearly 60 years, since she was a teenager. Well, late last month, Reverend Alston and Miss Jones, with 4 other people, drove 11 hours from Chicago to attend an hour of Judge Jackson's hearing. Reverend Alston said she was moved by the judge's courage, grace, integrity, and wisdom. She imagined what it will be like years from now to tell her future grandchildren what it was like to be in that room for that historic moment. And Ricky Jones said she never even expected to hear about a black woman being nominated to the Supreme Court, let alone to be in the room for her hearing. She said as she watched Judge Jackson, "It felt like the fulfillment of everything I've worked for my whole life." She thought of all the strong black women who came before her and helped make the movement possible. Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Ida B. Wells, and my personal late friend, the Reverend Willie Barrow, a black woman minister from Chicago who worked alongside Dr. Martin Luther King. This moment was about them too, she said. And this moment is possible because of Judge Jackson and who she is, her qualifications, her integrity, her record of excellence. She has earned her seat on the Supreme Court. That's why it's so unfortunate that several Republicans on the Judiciary Committee did not approach Judge Jackson's hearing with that same level of fairness and respect as their colleagues. Thankfully, there are members of the Senate who are willing to rise above the partisan fray. I want to particularly commend Senator Susan Collins of Maine, Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, and Senator Mitt Romney of Utah for their political courage and their willingness to support a singularly qualified and historic nominee to the Supreme Court. You know, when Senator Romney announced his support for Judge Jackson's confirmation, I couldn't help but remember his father, the late George Romney, who served as governor of Michigan in the 1960s during the height of the Civil Rights Movement. Governor George Romney knew a thing or two about political courage. As a proud Republican governor in 1963, he marched alongside of the NAACP Detroit president Edward Turner in support of civil rights. That same year, when Dr. Martin Luther King organized a march in Detroit, Governor George Romney declared the occasion Freedom Day in Michigan. To my colleague, Senator Mitt Romney, you are your father's son. This week marks 54 years since the shot rang out in Memphis, Tennessee, claiming the life of Dr. Martin Luther King, an American who spoke with greater moral clarity than nearly any other in our history. The night before he died, Dr. King spoke at a rally in support of the city's striking sanitation workers. There was tension in the air. From the moment he set foot in Memphis, he'd received a barrage of death threats. And as Dr. King spoke to the crowd at the Mason Temple, death was on his mind. He said, "Like anybody, I'd like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will, and he's allowed me to go up to the mountain." His next words proved prophetic. Dr. King said, "I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." Ricky Jones said that she thought about Dr. King's prophecy when she realized the Judiciary Committee was voting on Judge Jackson's nomination on the anniversary of Dr. King's death. It felt like the prophecy had come to pass. Dr. King didn't make it to the promised land, but Judge Jackson's ascension to the Supreme Court brings us closer to that longed-for place. I'd like to close with one last personal plea to my Senate colleagues. I hope you'll think about this. In the years to come, long after we've left the Senate, one of our grandchildren may ask where we were on this historic day, April 7th, 2022, when America broke down what seemed like an impossible racial barrier and voted to send the first African-American woman to serve on our highest court. I will be proud to say I was on the Senate floor, standing at my desk and casting my vote with pride for the next Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. I hope my colleagues will join me in sharing this historic moment. And I yield the floor. The absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President,
Republican leader, we are in a quorum call.
ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
President Biden was elected on the promise that he would govern as a moderate and unite the country. He insisted the radical left would not be calling the shots.
Please. Senator will commence.
He insisted the radical left would not be calling the shots on his watch. But when it came to one of the most consequential decisions a president can make, a lifetime appointment to our highest court, the Biden administration let the radicals run the show. With Washington Democrats in power, the far left got the reckless inflationary spending they wanted. The far left has gotten the insecure border they wanted. And today, the far left will get the Supreme Court justice they wanted. The fringe activists who demand partisan court packing, attack the justices, and describe our Constitution as trash, made up their minds from the start of this administration. If a Supreme Court vacancy should arise, they wanted one nominee and one nominee only, Judge Jackson. They spent dark money to promote this person specifically. They pushed her for the D.C. Circuit. Then they badgered Justice Breyer to quit. In February, one of these groups announced Judge Jackson would be the nominee before President Biden actually did make the announcement. So think about that for a moment. The Senate has examined Judge Jackson's qualifications with the seriousness and vigor that a lifetime appointment deserves. Unlike when the party's position first, the country was not subjected to uncorroborated smear campaigns, committee boycotts, stunts with cardboard cutouts, or mobs chasing senators around the Capitol. Now, a few of our Democratic colleagues seem to have decided in advance they would claim that Judge Jackson was treated shabbily. I've heard that script recited, even though it didn't happen. Didn't happen. Let's be clear. No nominee before the Senate for any position deserves a cakewalk or a coronation. Tough questions about a federal judge's own rulings and statements are the definition of fair game. My Republican colleagues vigorously inquired, shed important new light on a frequently disturbing judicial record. So I applaud my colleagues for focusing on substance and not following the Democrats' recent precedents into the gutter. Unfortunately, what the Senate's process turned up was disturbing. First, the nominee would not follow the Ginsburg-Breyer precedent and denounce the insane concept of partisan court packing. Second, her judicial record is full of cases where Judge Jackson ruled like a policymaker implementing personal biases instead of a judge following the text wherever it led. And third, her aggressive judicial activism frequently focused on treating convicted criminals as gently as possible. In literally case after case, from deadly fentanyl to open borders to child exploitation, Judge Jackson tilted the scales of justice away from public safety and innocent victims in favor of her career-long passion for softening up criminal sentencing. In Judge Jackson's courtroom, plain legal text and clear congressional intent were no match for what the judge admits are her personal policy disagreements. Even as a violent crime wave sweeps America, Democrats are pursuing a nationwide campaign to make the justice system softer on crime. They're stacking the deck with far-left prosecutors, woke warriors at the Department of Justice, and federal judges who believe criminals deserve lighter treatment. This project is terrible for innocent American families, and every piece of evidence suggests Democrats view Judge Jackson as its crown jewel. So I'll close with this. These debates about judicial philosophy are not just academic. The charged political atmosphere around confirmations, the outsized role that unelected judges play in our national life, these are direct consequences of liberal judicial activism. They're direct results of the efforts to misuse federal courts as a progressive legislature that voters can't kick out. A republic of self-serving citizens should not spend every June watching with bated breath to see if 5 or 6 lawyers will hand down sweeping policy changes with zero basis in the written Constitution. And the solution is not to make the court even more of a super legislature like liberals want, a delegitimizing death spiral that would destroy the rule of law. There's only one solution. The Senate should only confirm justices who will follow the text of our laws and our Constitution wherever it leads, who will leave subjective policy judgments on this side of the street where they belong. That's how we lower the temperature. That's how we shore up the courts. That's how we protect the rule of law. Staff the judiciary with brilliant men and women who understand and embrace this limited role. No other road leads anywhere good for our great nation.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, this is a wonderful day, a joyous day, an inspiring day for the Senate, for the Supreme Court, and for the United States of America. Today, we are here to vote to confirm Ketanji Brown Jackson as the 116th Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Now, a few days ago, I spoke with a group of 8th graders from Cheektowaga, New York. Many of them were students of color. It was amazing. When I mentioned that this week we were confirming the judge, you could see them light up, the unmistakable look in their eyes. One day, each young lady thought to herself, I can do it too. You know, it's been a dark 2 years with COVID. People getting sick and dying, many of whom we knew, stores closing, schools shutting their doors. But even in the darkest times, there are bright lights. Today is one of the brightest lights, and let us hope it's a metaphor, an indication of many more bright lights to come. As I've said over and over again, there are 3 words that I think best fit Judge Jackson: brilliant, beloved, belongs. Judge Jackson is in every sense and by all measures a brilliant jurist. She is indeed a brilliant person. By the judge's own telling, she first discovered her calling to the law not in a classroom or by reading a book or by talking to lawyers, but by sitting at the kitchen table next to her dad, filling out her coloring book while her dad poured through case law. Years from now, other parents and other daughters will do the same, and it will be Justice Jackson's opinions that will lay open on the table. The judge's parents, her entire family, should beam with pride that this day has come. At every step of her upbringing and career, Ketanji Brown Jackson ranked among the highest of achievers. And look, we should take a moment to note that Judge Jackson will be the first and only justice with experience as a public defender. We're proud of that, and America is proud of that. It will enhance the court's ability to preserve a basic truth in our country, that all deserve equal justice under the law, from the privileged to the impoverished. In an imperfect world, the judge conquered so many hurdles, and today stands as one of the most experienced individuals ever nominated to the Supreme Court. For this reason, the judge is also beloved by individuals and organizations across the political spectrum. I went through her record carefully, and never did I find one instance of a peer or colleague or associate say one negative word about her. It was incredible. When we go through these records, you often find someone here and there who will badmouth the individual who knew them. Not with just Judge Jackson. And lest we forget, the judge is popular in the minds of the American people. A Gallup poll released after her hearing showed nearly 60% of the public supports her confirmation, 10 points above the historical norm. And there is no question here, the country, by and large, wants the Senate to confirm Judge Jackson. Police chiefs want to confirm Judge Jackson. Conservative and moderate and liberal judges all want us to confirm Judge Jackson. And I thank my colleagues in this chamber who worked in good faith to make sure the Senate can finish its work today. Finally, as I've said many times, the judge belongs on the Supreme Court. By that, I mean something very specific. In our nation's history, 115 individuals have been confirmed by this body to serve on the Supreme Court of the United States. Of those, 108 have been white men. Only 4 have been women. Only 2 have been African American. But Ketanji Brown Jackson will be the first African American woman ever to hold the title of justice. Think about the impact that will have on our democracy. Untold millions of kids will open textbooks and see pictures of Justice Jackson among the highest ranks of our public figures. How many millions of kids in generations past could have benefited from such a role model? How many would-be justices, lawyers, doctors, generals, business people have been lost to history precisely because their history books had few, if any, role models that they could relate to? We certainly have a long way to go on the road to true justice, but by confirming Judge Jackson today, we are taking a bold step forward towards reaching the full realization of our country's promise. We will make it far more likely that girls across America will feel precisely what Judge Jackson felt herself when she was a kid. Nobody can stop me. I can do this too. I am brilliant too. I belong too. For all these reasons, increasing the diversity of the court has been one of my highest priorities and one of the highest priorities of our Senate Democratic majority, of whom I am so proud. Justice Jackson is the most important example, but we've been working on this for over a year. Of the 58 Senate-confirmed federal judges since we took the majority, 3/4 have been women. 2/3 have been people of color. And it's not just racial and gender diversity that matters. We have strived to lift up judges that bring diversity through their experience. More public defenders in our courts, more civil rights lawyers, more election lawyers. When Americans of all walks of life come before the court, they should have confidence that those who don the robes have the ability to walk in their own shoes, to see and understand their side of the story, and then apply the law properly according to the facts. One judge at a time, one judge at a time, this majority is expanding the possibility of who merits consideration to the bench. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge my Republican colleagues who joined us on this occasion over the year to achieve this goal. In closing, I want to thank Chairman Durbin for beautifully executing this nomination process. It was equal parts fair, thorough, and expeditious. No easy feat in this modern Senate. I want to thank all of my Democratic colleagues on the Judiciary Committee. You were just fabulous, every one of you, for your respectful and insightful examination of the judge's record. And I want to thank my Republican colleagues who chose to take this process seriously, no matter which side you voted on. The President sent us an impressive nominee. She merited a robust and thoughtful and lively examination. I thank the members who did it precisely that. In short, Madam President, this is one of the great moments of American history. At the time of our Constitution's ratification, in most states you had to be a white, male, Protestant landowner to be considered part of American society. So from the get-go, generations of Americans have sought to establish the United States as a full democracy. We fought a bloody civil war to end slavery. Women organized and reached for the ballot. The civil rights movement brought an end to the vicious segregation of the mid-20th century. And today, we are taking a giant, bold, and important step on the well-trodden path to fulfilling our country's founding promise. This is a great moment for Judge Jackson, but it is even a greater moment for America as we rise to a more perfect union. I thank my colleagues for their work, and I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, all post-cloture time has expired. The question occurs on the nomination of Ketanji Brown Jackson of the District of Columbia to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is, And certainly appears to be a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Barrasso. No. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Bennett. Aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Blunt. No. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Booker. Yes. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, no. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, no. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, no. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, no. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, no. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mrs. Fisher. No. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mrs. Gillibrand. Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Haggerty. No. Mr. Haggerty, no. Ms. Hassan. Aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Hawley. No. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Heinrich. Aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper. Aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Ms. Hirono. Aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Hoven. No. Mr. Hoven, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. No. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, no. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Johnson. No. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Kane. Aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Kelly. Aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Kennedy. No. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. King. Aye. Mr. King, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Leahy. Aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Lujan. Aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Manchin. Aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Markey. Aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Marshall. No. Mr. Marshall, no. Mr. McConnell. No. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Menendez. Aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Merkley. Aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran voted in the negative. Ms. Murkowski. Aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Murphy. Aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mrs. Murray. Aye. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Ossoff. Aye. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Padilla. Aye. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Romney? Mr. Romney, aye. Ms. Rosen? Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Rounds? Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. Rubio? Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Sanders? Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Sass? Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Schatz? Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Schumer? Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida? Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mrs. Shaheen? Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Shelby? Mr. Shelby, no. Ms. Sinema? Ms. Sinema, aye. Ms. Smith? Ms. Smith, aye. Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Tester? Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Thune? Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Tillis? Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Toomey? Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Tuberville? Mr. Tuberville, no. Mr. Van Hollen? Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Warner? Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Warnock? Mr. Warnock, aye. Ms. Warren? Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Wicker? Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Wyden? Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, no. Mr. Graham? Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Paul, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 53, the nays are 47, and this nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will immediately be notified of the Senate's action.
Madam President, very happily, I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President.
We're in a quorum call. The senator from Hawaii is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm here today to speak in support of the nomination and confirmation of Christopher Lohman to be the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Sustainment. We are in a fight for the free world, and that requires maintaining a robust military presence with our allies, including and especially NATO countries. Any U.S. mission also needs a strong logistics chain. That means being able to move troops, medical supplies, fuel, tents, anything else throughout the world at any given